It's a lovely spring day here on the left coast, and welcome to the 15th episode of the Constitution. What Constitution? Today we are going to be dealing with a very long quote from Frederick Douglass, which, if I read, would possibly take up our entire hour, so I won't read the question. But it is addressing the historical ambiguity of American citizenship and how the legal understanding is currently being challenged. But before we get to that, it is time for another moment of America's transitioning to authoritarian government. I hope you noticed my use of transitioning there, gentlemen. I came across a wonderful op-ed this week, which was responding to our number 47 occupant of the Oval Office desire to have the Declaration of Independence housed in the Oval Office. The author pointed out the irony that if we did so, it would probably be a good idea if he actually read the Declaration of Independence, because he would find that he probably has violated a few of the grievances that the colonists had towards the king, such as he has refused to assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. Just look at how DJT has treated the Civil Service Act or recent laws banning TikTok. Let's see, he has obstructed the administration of justice. Self-explanatory. Don't need to go through a laundry list of the dozens and dozens of times he's obstructed justice. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. God, I love that line. Just one word, Doge. So one might suggest again that before King Donald posts the Declaration in the Oval Office, that he probably, if he can read, should probably read the dang document. So let's find out what our band thinks about this day in history, 1925, when the Tennessee State Legislature passed a law criminalizing the teaching of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution in public schools. Is this a need to know, nice to know, or nuts to know, Professor Kavanaugh?
That's a need to know. I think it's a need to know. It is, obviously leads to what we call the Scopes monkey trial. And at the time, it was called the trial of the century until the next trial of the century. Media flocked to this smaller town in Tennessee to cover it. Media at the day was radio, of course, radio and print. And it was a big deal. Now, obviously, I think he ends up paying $1 fine or something like that. But you had two incredible heavyweights there, too. Clarence Darrow in defense, and the special prosecutor brought in former presidential candidate, William Jennings Bryan. So, and which leads to a great play called Inherit the Wind. So there's so much to go from that, but I think it's a need to know.
Professor Moore.
Yeah, I definitely need to know. I mean, I think a lot of teachers, when they're doing a survey class in high school, the 20s is one of those moments in American history where there's a crossroads of a lot of things culturally. So there's this modernism versus traditionalism. And I think using the Scopes trial is a great example of that framework of how pivotal the events were in the 20s in terms of cultural change. So yeah, I'd say it's definitely need to know.
Professor Williams.
Yeah, it's need to know. I mean, we're gonna know like after World War II, when democracies get established in Europe. I mean, United States is going to end up and still is kind of an outlier in terms of surveys about what people think of science and whether to trust science and things like that. And I think that case and what Tennessee was doing kind of is a good marker point to just think about how that's going to continue to develop through the 20th and 21st centuries.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. Just so in case kids come across the old black and white Inherit the Wind as Professor Kavanaugh with Spencer Tracy playing Clarence Darrow. That's the best version out there, by the way, students and teachers, if you ever want to invest some time in it. But it's a nice archival representation of this battle between science and religion there. But given what's going on today, it'll give students a reference of what those cultural battles, how they played out throughout the 20th century. So thank you, gentlemen, for your insights into that historic moment. So it's now time to get to our discussion on the evolving understanding of citizenship. And today we are going to begin with our native Hoosier, who, as I understand it, was the only male student at Hickory High to get cut from the basketball team. In response, he helped start the Hickory High swim team and currently holds all individual swim records at the school. Professor Chris Kavanaugh. So, Chris, what historical antecedents, i.e., the Greeks, Romans, British views of citizenship, influenced the American concept of who could become a citizen of a nation state?
Well, when I set those records, it was just swimming across a creek, so it wasn't very difficult. And
But isn't
they were
that a creek?
proceeding.
Is it a creek or a crick?
It's a creek in southern Indiana for sure.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks for that flashback. Um, I think, David, all of those areas that you mentioned, all those time periods, whether it be Greek or Roman, and I would also throw in the Enlightenment period, separate perhaps from British citizenship, and I'll get to that in a second. But I think all of those and early state prior to the Constitution will influence that. I mean, if you look at in Athens, right, the Greek city-state, that idea of citizenship was absolutely tied to the democratic process. But remember, this was a very exclusive club. You women were not, slaves were not, foreigners, non-Greeks were not included in that. So the idea of citizenship in ancient Greece was important. Again, opening the door to that democratic process, but not, again, very exclusive in terms of who gets to be in the club. Probably similar to early ideas of who got to vote in the early republic of white male property owners.
Well, can you give me what is your understanding of the term of the concept citizen? All right. What does that involve? I mean, it's obviously a form of identity. It's obviously a form of, I guess, ownership to some degree. How can a constitutional republic be exclusive in its identification of who a citizen is?
I don't know. We could look at, I think we're going to get into the early American Republic prior to the 14th Amendment, where we were pretty exclusive. I think the idea of citizenship or citizen, it extends a certain level of protection or a certain level of rights or a certain level of access, and probably all three of those by bestowing that concept of citizen. So I could be, I could be a slave in Athens, and I would not necessarily what we think of slaves, or
Right.
American slavery, African slavery, and I would still be entitled to some protections of the law. But the idea is I don't have the right to vote. I don't have the right to speak in the assembly. I don't have the right to hold public office. And I mean, the Greeks viewed citizenship as a form of active participation in political life. So that it's, that's that. Uh,
So I'm
Romans,
curious. Well, can you distinguish there? So what would be the value of having the title citizen if you weren't granted those privileges or rights?
well, you wouldn't get the title.
Well, I thought you just said you could be a citizen, but you couldn't vote.
No, no, I said I could be like if I was an enslaved person, I would get some rights, but I would not get the full benefit of Greek or Athenian citizenship.
Oh, okay. I
So
misunderstood.
I would have some protections under the law, but I'm not going to be able to participate in the political process. Again, speak in assembly, vote, hold office, those types of things. Now, I think the Romans are actually kind of interesting because the Roman Empire, as it expands the idea of citizenship. I mean, they're going to offer Roman citizenship as the empire begins to take over part of the known world. Oh, you guys, we're going to defeat you, or you can join, and hey, some of you get to be citizens, and you get the protection of being a Roman citizen, where you can walk all the way across the Roman Republic and have that protection, right? It allows certain legal rights, such as right to vote, marry, own property, have that protection under Roman law. And the Roman idea of citizenship expanded with the Constitution of Antotinia. I'm probably saying that wrong. About 2012 CE, right? which granted citizenship to nearly all the free inhabitants of the empire. And even enslaved people could earn their freedom. You think of the Stoic philosopher Epictetus. He started as an enslaved person, but eventually earned his freedom. So the Romans really expand the idea of citizenship, which is really kind of a precursor to the broadening of the idea, similar to what we do. Now, I think when you get into Britain, you're going to talk about common law, right? The English system, the idea, and going back to maybe even Magna Carta, rights linked to that. And we know that when we've said on our program before, Magna Carta obviously only applies to the nobles. So when we think about this expansion of rights, but it did limit the power of the monarch and guarantees certain rights, which are going to be echoed eventually in the English Bill of Rights and the US Bill of Rights. Now, I think that's interesting to think about is when our boy John Locke comes along and he talks about the idea of citizenship and like children couldn't be citizens because they can't consent. And you have to be able to give your consent to be a citizen under his thinking. And I think that thinking also and that Enlightenment thinking will influence the founding fathers as well. But I think so much of it here, when we get on this side of the Atlantic, in the early colonial systems, you're a property owner. You've got to be a member of the church, depending on where you live. So that we also have a very exclusive idea originally of citizenship. But that it expands, really more importantly, it expands the franchise and the ability to participate in the political process.
Yeah, Tim.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I was listening to Chris. The ancients also, well, Americans, we tend to define citizenship. Citizens are rights-bearing entities, and I think that's a part of the heritage we inherited from Europe and the ancients. But I would urge students to really slow down and consider another piece that the ancients worked with, and it was almost relational. That if you just lived in a polis and you were known, there wasn't an emphasis on, I mean, if I'm a citizen, I have rights. The thinking is more, I'm a citizen and I belong. The rights, and I think Chris is right that the legal framework comes with the Romans, but the Greeks have this element of belongingness. If you're a citizen, I mean, I mean, if you one of the criteria is you had to have a known genealogy.
Versus
I
an
guess.
unknown genealogy.
Well, again, the polis these were tight communities. They were very communitarian. We call that, communitarianism, but you had to be known before you could belong. And the wandering, person through town is you're not from around here. So there's this element of relational and organic definition of citizenship the ancients had, and I appreciated Chris's delineating that there's a big break with Rome. There's a big change when Rome starts to define citizenship.
I think of a couple of ways to think about this, and I'm going to put a good piece in the show notes. Really, I am, and it talks about shots fired. Talks about the difference between ascriptive and consensual citizenship. Do we ascribe citizenship to people? And I think that's what Tim is talking about, being in a place, right? Or consensual because I'm going to consent. That's where we're getting into this Lockean idea of consent.
Well, going back, you had mentioned, Chris, that in some cultures you may not be born into citizenship, but you could earn it, i.e., through the going from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. That as they consumed territories, some elements of those who they consumed were given the opportunity to become citizen. Is that true also, like of medieval Europe? What I'm thinking about is martial. That is, if you served in the military, was that a process in some cultures by a way you could earn citizenship?
In some places, yeah. I mean, even some of our early founding fathers thought if you served in the military, picked up a musket in defense, then you should be entitled to, well, I say I say citizenship, but you should be entitled to vote.
Oh, okay.
So I mean, so yes, absolutely. But
Yeah.
but
Well, and the Greeks did that too. Warriors became, and in Rome,
Right.
well,
becoming a
it
warrior.
depends on which Greek city
Yeah,
state you're talking
right,
about, right?
right.
Some were very protective and some were more open. But the Romans on their part, that's just smart. We're not gonna, you're not a conquered people. And I know I've learned these terms from Tim. You're part of the realm. You're not part of the domain. You're part of the realm. Come on in. Because we don't want to have to keep an army there. We don't have to keep fighting you. So we're just going to say, hey, join us, right? Because if you don't, we are going to wipe you out. But if you join us, then you're a Roman citizen, and hey, all's good.
So, Professor Moore, looking at how getting to the United States now, how the founders framers eventually framed citizenship within our constitutional structure, couldn't it
They
be
did.
argued that Frederick Douglass is wrong in this very long, elongated quote here? All right, which the students and teachers will have. Part of me, I read it and I'm kind of thinking, okay, nice warm fuzzy, but you're wrong, Frederick. There. So, am I right on that? Can it be interpreted that he's wrong in his understanding of citizenship in 1853?
Well, I found the full speech. And by the way, students and teachers, the link that's in the question that was sent out is no longer exists, and so the folks at the Center for Civic Education are going to put a new link and send out that question again to the actual full speech that Douglas gave. But the speech is interesting because he goes through all of these categories. Now, if you're going to challenge Douglas on his legal and constitutional reasoning.
Yes.
I think you're onto something there. Although I think there's a little wiggle room for him. He can come out of this with a little dignity in your world. But the speech goes through all these different categories, and it's quite interesting. He has these categories of the principles of the Declaration, the meaning of the Constitution, admission of statesmen. There's a whole section on where he lifts the debates that were surrounding the admission of Missouri and the various nuances of whether African Americans could own property if they moved into Missouri. And he pulls some of those speeches that were in Congress about that and infers that that from those speeches that citizenship was kind of embedded in the debates about Missouri. He makes the war argument. We have fought for this country. The old, ancients, you could gain citizenship if you fought for the country. He also taught, we've suffered in this country. So therefore, he makes an economic argument. So there's all kinds of categories of citizenship that he goes through in this speech. So to your question directly, is he wrong? Well, if I'm pushing back a little bit, David, because I think he, your question is based on the premise that constitutional definitions of citizenship are the only definitions of citizenship. Well, the speech, he wanders around all kinds of different silos, being a political scientist here all of a sudden now, these different kinds of arguments making his case for citizenship. Now, I do think his argument constitutionally is in the penumbras and emanations of the Constitution, because he makes this interesting argument.
Great. He says this 100 years before that concept of penumbras and emanations appeared.
Well, I'll be a little anachronistic here.
Oh my God. Yeah.
So he says that, the Privileges and Immunities Clause makes no distinction in color. So therefore, we're persons. And so therefore, we have privileges and immunities. Now, so there's that constitutional logic in his speech. So I find that interesting. Now, I think it's debatable. But I would urge students to read the full speech and see those different kinds of citizenship or rationales for citizenship, cultural, legal, religious. He makes that argument too. So there's a lot of different kinds of evidence that he's using in that speech.
Yeah, there's no doubt that he's appealing to a philosophical, moral argument, pulling at the heartstrings here. But I guess that his reference to the Declaration, I guess. Yeah, we might be able to, just looking at the words, which I'm assuming that's what he's doing, because we've talked a lot about the context and the
Yep.
purpose of the Declaration there. But the Constitution, I don't understand when he says the meaning of the United States Constitution confers citizenship.
Well, he focuses on people.
Yeah,
We the people.
but
Now, the details is who's in that category of people. So I think he's so that's why I think it's a little squishy to
right. So
say it's a
well,
slam. Yeah.
So would you suggest, therefore, that students be a little bit nuanced on this? That they've got to take him to task a little bit on this notion here.
Well, I think the speech itself provides the nuance with all the different categories of reasoning. So yeah, if I was a judge in Unit 6, I would, if they're hung up on constitutional definitions, I'd say, well, is there any other basis of citizenship other than the Constitution and law and legal things?
Well, that's where I guess I'm a little bit, I don't know if it's confused is the right word, but uneasy because you've got this long quote and this fairly nuanced, description by Douglas or argument by Douglas, but then you get to the exact question that the students have to deal with, and it says, how did the U.S. Constitution originally define the federal government's role in determining citizenship? Well, that's pretty straightforward and pretty simple, don't you think? And
Yeah, they didn't. Well, they punted to the
they
states.
punted,
Yeah.
which do you see what I mean? I guess
Sure. Well, and that's why we get, I think it's Corfield. There's a couple of cases culminating in the Dred Scott. I mean, that's why the courts have to continually sort out the definition because the Constitution doesn't clearly say that. It punts it to the states.
Chris, you were going to jump in.
Well, I think one, I was going to say I was going to compare the different takes he puts down in the speech to Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail, and the idea appealing to a lot of different areas like Dr. King does in his letter from Birmingham jail, legal, philosophical, religious, moral, all different, and Douglas does that. But you got to remember, this was in 1853. This was to the audience, and I do think there's an argument there when he relies on Article 4 and the privileges and immunities. I think that's a solid argument because in Article 4, which is what he's alluding to, because obviously the 14th Amendment has not been even written or ratified yet. So I think there's a legal argument within the Constitution about privileges and immunities of citizenship and because we know at the founding era that African Americans in some states were allowed to vote. They were allowed certain rights.
Well, that was up to the states to decide, right?
I'm sorry?
It was up to the states to decide that.
Yeah.
Yes, it was up to the state, but the idea that, these certain, again, privileges or immunities is defined in Article 4, absolutely. So I think but I think for the students, think about everything that Tim just described and the stuff that David was kind of pushing back on, but also think of the context and really dive into that Article 4 because that really is the constitutional argument.
Mike?
Yeah, Dave, I think this is a really good question that you're asking. And when I read through the speech, I was thinking about the larger debate that was happening right now in the 1850s about whether African Americans could be citizens and could have any rights under the existing Constitution. And Douglas is having that sort of meta debate with others who would just say, no, you just can't. And at this point in the debate, Douglas is trying to make the argument that idea of what it actually means. But he's, to Tim's point, he's not making this argument to the Supreme Court in a case. To me, this is more like he's obviously making a political argument. He's trying to have people reimagine or imagine what it could be like. And it seems to be very consistent, just I don't know. There were a lot of states people and a lot of ordinary folks in this time period. I don't know, 1820s through up to the Civil War. It seemed like these types of public discussions about what the Constitution meant or how to interpret it, how this second generation of Americans was going to wear it. I think it was happening in a lot of different areas. I mean, obviously under the Jackson administration, there was all sorts of discussions about what the Constitution could mean and what it might mean. So I think it's in the speech is kind of fitting within that historical context as well.
So back at you, Mike. It's been mentioned that the Dred Scott decision here, and given that ruling, we know how the Constitution, all right, understood by the Supreme Court, which is that's how our system works, um, treated Africans and citizenship. What I'm real curious about, and it's an area that I've always been a little bit fuzzy on, and that is Native Americans. And so I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about how Native Americans fit into this discussion and narrative on American citizenship, both before and after the 14th Amendment.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting because I think that the original Constitution, the founders are much clearer about Native Americans than they are maybe about African Americans. I mean, Article One, looks like Article One, Section Two, directing how representatives are going to be counted in taxes, where we get the three-fifths clause, is also where we get the phrase, you know, Indians not taxed will not be part of the count. And what that phrase means, students, is that if Native Americans had assimilated through marriage or through religion, and they were taxed, then they could be counted as people um, for the congressional vote. But Indians not taxed was building into this idea that the founders believed that Indians, Native Americans in their groups were sovereign political groups that were going to be treated as more like a foreign nation than folks in the polis, right? And later on in the Constitution, Article One, Section 8, you know, the Commerce Clause specifically states that Congress has the power to regulate commerce among foreign nations, among the several states, and with Indian tribes. Again, making it very explicit that they're just going to be counted as outside. So the early constitutional law, the decisions on this, this is what the Marshall Court decided in the very beginning. I think the first important case on this is maybe the Cherokee Nation Georgia case, where they are Native Americans are defined as domestic dependent nations, and that's consistent with how Marshall read the 1790 Naturalization Act that said only free white males could become citizens. So all that is kind of just um, that's how Native Americans are treated before the 14th Amendment. You wanted me to say something about after the 14th Amendment as
Yeah,
well?
so is there a shift for Native Americans as there was with African Americans?
Um, a, a little, I guess. Let me get this right. The key phrase in the 14th Amendment is subject to the jurisdiction thereof, right? In terms of um, to be born in the United States, you are a citizen if you are subject to the jurisdiction thereof. And there was some common law cases on this. I'm trying to bring them up right now. Elk v. Wilkins in 1884 that decided that if sorry, I'm having some glitches over here. Um, sorry, decided that a Native American could voluntarily leave their Native
Right.
American group, but if they didn't, then they would be not subject to the jury. And so, even if you were Native American, made the argument, I was born in the United States, I am a citizen, and the court said, no, you were not, because when you were born, you had not yet voluntarily left your other nation. So that's going to be the law, and the citizenship provision is not going to come until 1925 when Congress recognizes that Native Americans can be citizens. So it's a long road, and but in some ways the Constitution and the courts are much more explicit about the reasons why and the process through which they could become citizens.
Yeah, gentlemen, do we have any idea why is that? I'm curious. Why is it that Native Americans, and I know even Jefferson draws a big distinction between Native Americans in the late 18th, early 19th century and African Americans and other groups. Any idea, is it just why is it that that big distinction between Native Americans and other groups?
Like, I think part of it is the idea that you're being treated as a separate nation, the nations within nations, right? Even though they are treated as subordinate. And I think that there, and which goes to the case Mike was talking about, L.B. Wilkins, to get American citizenship, you must give up your tribal citizenship. You can't have both, right? Which becomes a problem. And they're the only ethnic group talked about in the Constitution. So I think there's that reluctance.
Yeah. I think the geography is critical here. I'm glad Mike pointed that out. But also, it was interesting to me when the issue of tax. I mean, that in the colonial era, uh, citizenship, well, there was no citizenship, they're all subjects. But
Right.
if you paid taxes or you owned a certain amount of property, you kind of functioned as a citizen within the community. So the issue of taxation and citizenship has deep roots going back to the colonial period.
Well, and I guess one of the
I
things.
guess I guess that's an economic form of
Yeah.
citizenship, really.
Well, I just, I was thinking about this. After the Mexican-American War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, all that territory, all the former Mexican nationals who are in that territory that defeat are granted citizenship. Now we don't do that with other, with our imperial situation. Is that correct? That is post Spanish American War, Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
We help
That's
me
the
out.
insular cases, Chris?
Yes, I've
Yeah.
already put
Yeah.
some in the show notes about that, the insular cases, and I would really
Yeah.
encourage the students to look that up because as Dave was alluding to, as we complete our manifest destiny and we finish our continental empire, we move across the seas, and as we take over some of these islands, that we will make them kind of citizens, but not going to want to give them the full protection of citizenship.
So is it all about geography, Tim, Chris, Mike here? I mean, we
It's
grant,
about it's about race.
well, but no, but we grant the former Mexican national citizenship and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo.
Yeah, because again, much like the Romans did, if you're going to conquer these people like we did in the Mexican American War, it's going to be a hell of a lot easier to make them citizens. We've already given Native Americans tribal reservations, right? So we'll continue to carve those out for them. And as we move overseas, as what did
But see, we don't do that as we move overseas.
I know, but that's my point. As we move overseas, we go into places like the Philippines, and as Teddy Roosevelt talks about, our little brown friends. One of the biggest reasons why, especially in the insular cases, is racism. It's just, I mean, it's that simple.
Well, I don't know if it's that
Well,
simple because it
I,
boggles the
I think,
mind.
yeah, I wonder though, I mean, post Civil War, there's this huge emphasis on assimilation, whether it's across the races. So I wonder if there's an expectation of, these people are assimilatable. So we'll waive citizenship out there. Now, these people over here, either because of geography or to Chris's point, race, they're not assimilatable. So I just wonder whether that paradigm in the late 19th century that dominated so much of our thinking, both in terms of immigration as well as assimilation,
Yeah,
I
I
just
would
wonder
even
whether if the expectation drove some of these nuances of how we treated
I would even
people.
push back against that, Tim, when you think about the birth of the Know Nothing parties, and the as we get into the anti-immigration, and we finally get to the
Yeah.
Chinese Exclusion Act, right? So I would who can be assimilated becomes the question. We think about first wave immigrants,
Well,
second wave immigrants.
well, yeah, in that period, it was the Irish they didn't think was assimilatable.
Yes,
Those are our people, Chris.
yeah, I know.
I just got to ask, you guys all have a handful of advanced degrees. Is there such a word as assimilatable?
Oh, sure, absolutely. We just coined it yesterday at on campus. Yes.
I just never heard it, but I'm the least educated on the panel, so I just wondered if,
There was some
Professor.
apoplectic people about this discussion. Yes.
I thought
I think the Marquis de Lafayette used that term.
that's
He
where I was
did.
going. I thought that maybe Tim was reading some of his works and came across this new word here, kind of thing. So Chris, um, could it, we're obviously, this question actually is very topical, very important question. At first I was a little cynical about it because of the, the amount of words, but you know, preparing for this and researching, obviously we're living in a time in which the current administration wants to change the understanding of the citizenship clauses in the 14th Amendment there. And I was looking at the arguments, and there's a few arguments, but one of them is the specific context of the 14th Amendment is dealing with the newly established free people. That the 14th Amendment citizenship clauses were specifically dealing with African residents in response to Dred Scott, and therefore the court was wrong in the Wong Kim Ark case of 1898, and birthright citizenship does not apply to all children of immigrants of the 21st century. Your thoughts about that argument?
It's hogwash.
Gently said. Why is
It's
it hogwash?
hogwash. Because here's what I would tell the students, and I'll put something in the show notes. Go back and look at Senator Lyman Trumbull's discussion about the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and also go back and look at Senator Howard's. And this is where people that will like to they base their argument on what Senator Howard says when he's talking about the citizenship clause, right? And they forget about the paragraph above what Howard says when he's describing the citizenship clause in the 14th Amendment, because there's a whole paragraph above that, right? That, and I'm going to see if I can. I think I got it up. Let me see if I have it here. Yeah. So bottom line is, I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but they say, right? And they asked Trumbull in 1866, and he was like, so could the gypsy or the foreigner or all that say, yeah, anybody that's born here is a citizen here. And then they make that carve out, as Mike alluded to earlier, under the jurisdiction thereof, and they make that carve out for people that are actually serving as foreign ambassadors, that more so, right? So that argument is, I mean, for the originalists, if you're going to use that method of constitutional interpretation, it's not a very good argument. When you look at what the arguments were in Congress for the Civil Rights Act, which actually of 1866, which has very similar language to the 14th Amendment establishing citizenship, almost not quite identical. But then when you ask the people to put these forward, right, they're very adamant about that, right?
Yeah. I'm just heartened to hear Chris as an originalist.
Well, I mean,
well, come on, Kagan said it. We're all originalists now, okay?
Okay,
I mean,
okay.
Tim, history does play a role.
Absolutely. Hopefully.
Well, so I mean that does beg the question, Chris, of as we've talked numerous times, and students in both units 3 and 4 have to deal with the judiciary and methods of interpretation. Part of me is trying to get my hands around, okay, what is the interpretive approach that those who want to overturn Wong Kim Ark, what interpretive approach are they using? Because you're absolutely right.
They're using that idea of consent, and the other term that I gave earlier, right? The consent and that's a fancy term. Basically, let me see if I can find it here. Bada bing, bada boom, bada bing. Shoot. Ascriptive or consensual. And so the idea, if you're born here, back to Locke, you can't consent to that citizenship. But I'm going to go back to something Howard said when he's debating this, and this is the author, right? This is the guy when he's talking about the citizenship clause, and I'm quoting here, simply declaratory of what I regard as the law of the land already, that every person born within the limits of the United States and subject to their jurisdiction, which if you're born here, right, you're living here for the most part, unless you're an ambassador or a foreign national, right? and subject to their jurisdiction is by virtue of natural law and national law a citizen of the United States. This will not, of course, include persons born in the United States who are foreigners, aliens, who belong to the families of ambassadors or foreign ministers accredited to the government of the United States, but will include every other class of person. And this is what people that want to hang their hat on that argument, they go to the second part where he says this will not, of course, include persons born in the United States who are foreigners, aliens, who belong to the families of ambassadors. And I've read an argument where people talk, well, there should be the word or in there. So, but if you read what Trumbull says, if you read what Howard says, I think the argument.
Clearly, the originalist argument, they can't win on that based on what you're saying. All right.
I don't.
Civil rights activation.
I'm a high school history teacher. I mean, I don't know what some of those unelected people in black robes are going to do.
Well, again, just using what we've talked about over the years here and our understanding collectively, it seems like there's they can't plant their feet in the originalist argument. It seems you're saying they could theoretically do a textualist argument.
They could try.
All right, Tim's nodding his head there, and that there's some kind of first principles philosophical.
But that becomes. But if you read what it says in the 14th Amendment, if you're born here, you're a citizen about the jurisdiction thereof, and people that are here, even the people that are here illegally,
are in the jurisdiction.
They're in the jurisdiction.
Yes.
There's the squashes your textualist argument.
Yeah.
I find it interesting that those that would want to undo all of this 100+ years of understanding of what the 14th Amendment means, they're kind of using an evolving constitution, or more properly, devolving constitution. So I find it interesting that the textualists are those that want to maintain the status quo are using a textualist, but those who want to change the status quo are circumstances have changed. That's a very loose
construction.
Kind of I think we've talked about methods of interpretation here. That's very loose. I find that interesting.
Yeah. Which again proves the point about this whole debate for decades. Is sometimes the academic language attached to this, it has no meaning because it's all contextual to the circumstances and in many ways the experiences and ideological framework of the individual judges there. So Mike, most Americans, when we talk about citizenship, we tend to focus a lot on the rights associated with that. But it's, as we've talked a lot about in this program, there's a two-sided coin. There's also responsibilities that are attached to citizenship. Through my teaching over those 3 decades, I would try to get kids to distinguish between the legal responsibilities and the moral responsibilities. Is there such a difference? I mean, is there such a distinction as a college professor, political science professor? Is there a distinction between a legal responsibility of citizenship and a moral responsibility, or is there no such thing as a moral responsibility of citizenship?
Oh no, I think there is. I mean, if we want to have a democratic republic, there definitely is. I mean, just so the students, I understand what should be my moral, and just so the students are on the same page, it's like an unethical what we ought to do to keep the place going. No one is going to give us a ticket or fine us if we don't. But are there things that we ought to be doing to keep our democratic republic going, and as responsibilities of citizenship? And I think definitely. And I think when students really kind of start writing things down and looking and thinking about, okay, what are the responsibilities of being a citizen? Well, we have to follow the laws. We have to pay taxes. We have to go to jury summons. When we're summons, we go to jury duty. Males have to register for the draft, right? Voting is not a legal responsibility of citizenship. And as the court pointed out, after the Civil War, and Minor v. Happersett, it's not even a part of being a citizen, right? The court in Happersett said women were definitely citizens of the United States, but didn't mean that they had the right to vote, right? Sorry, you want to get in there, Chris, on this?
Well, the line is women, like children,
yes,
are citizens, which is, I love that. I mean, that's a lovely line.
Yeah, sometimes some people call that the good old days. So go on, Mike.
Yeah. So, so yeah, there are, I mean, so what ought we be doing? We ought to be staying informed about what's going on in our communities. We ought to educate ourselves on those issues. I think we ought to uh, practice civic virtue towards each other, and we ought to probably vote, right? And have a say. None of those things are legally things that we have to do. Other democracies in the world make those types of things legal responsibilities. And we've talked about that on different episodes of this show. And students can have these debates about whether it's a good idea, like in Australia, where it's a legal responsibility to vote. And if you don't, you get fined, right? Um, Other countries in Europe, it's a legal responsibility to serve in the military for 2 years, whether in the National Guard, right? There are different ways that societies will um, enforce these citizenship responsibilities. But as to Tim's point earlier, we are so focused on seeing people as individual rights bearers rather than as individual responsibility bearers, and even more so, to Tim's point, even consider themselves as part of a group that may have a value all its own that is just not the sum of its parts that we have to pay attention to. So I think we inherit that just from our colonial traditions, all the way through our version of the Enlightenment that Tim has talked to us about on previous shows.
Well, clarify for me or help me clarify, because I've always believed that in an international comparison, that our country, both state and national, that we require very little of our citizens when it comes
Yeah,
to responsibilities relative to other nations, other constitutional democratic nations.
yeah,
Am I accurate on that, or is that
yeah.
just some kind of, apocryphal notion I got in my head?
No, you're absolutely right. Um, Other places require, as I said, national service. They require the vote. I mean, other places make paying taxes much easier. And I'm not sure. I think in some ways you can see that as as your responsibility as a citizen is made much easier. The government just kind of tells you what you owe and you check it off and send it back. Um, I think that you look at something like in I know there's been talk in the media about Germany or even other EU countries about what you can say in public, the types of words, or can you have a political party um, based on fascism or Nazism. I see those types of laws as um, kind of promulgating a certain responsibility to folks, right? Saying, okay, you can't do whatever you want. You can't start a party under every philosophy you want. And that your responsibility as a citizen, if you're going to get into the political arena, is you're going to use certain types of language and you're going to use certain types of party philosophies. And we just do not have that tradition in the United States in the same kind. Well, we don't have it now. I think we've had periods of it,
Yeah.
um, but we don't have it now.
I think Tocqueville noticed this, when he wandered around and he noticed all these volunteer associations where people just got together and did these moral, not moral in a religious sense, but there were these moral obligations that they felt to each other. So the volunteerism piece was noticeable in Tocqueville's Democracy in America.
Yeah, he called us a nation of joiners. But I think it's funny though, Mike, listening to you and thinking, okay, serve on jury duty or serve on jury duty and pay taxes are two of the things you listed, two things that Americans try and get out of.
Yeah.
The bar is so low for us in terms of our responsibilities, and yet we still try to get out of those.
Yeah.
Well, Tim, you brought up Tocqueville. He also said that Americans turn every question, moral question, whatever question, into a legal question. Is that
Well,
part of our? Go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah, he does. I mean, that's why I just last year reread Tocqueville, and to me it was really with some fresh eyes. It'd been a long time. He noticed paradox. He noticed these disconnects. And those are wonderful chapters. And that's one of those where he's describing this virtuous, fuzzy, communitarian impulse in Americans, and we'll go to court and sue each other in a nanosecond. So I don't know that Tocqueville he's not obliging himself to make total sense and reasoned to defend America. In fact, he has great suspicions about America, uh, that would this democracy experiment survive?
So, Professor Moore, we got to deal with the reality that we exist in today. And you've heard me for weeks now, and I know it makes you uncomfortable, but go on my personal rants about what we are experiencing as a nation. America and Americans face a very real threat, in my opinion, of an authoritarian type of government. Of a suspension of our constitutional way of life, the destruction of our constitutional principles, and again, the very program that we're trying to serve here is all about building those principles, strengthening our constitutional, core, as some might say. So I'm curious, what rights and responsibilities? Let's forget about rights. Well, maybe not forget about rights, but what rights and responsibilities do citizens have in resisting this rise to tyrannical government? I mean, and I harken back. I'm doing a lot of reading right now on 1930s Germany, not 1938, 39, but I'm talking about 32, 33, 34, and actually before that, late 20s, early 30s. As this momentum's happening there, what are the German people doing? Because a lot of people don't understand. The National Socialist, they win an election. All right, they're elected into, and then there's some maneuvering going on in their parliamentary system there. So I'm just wondering, what are our responsibilities here as we're in this very, very difficult time in American history?
Yeah, yeah, your opening statements in the last several months have made me a little squeamish but I have to be generous because what comes to mind is the old the frog in the pot analogy. You don't know that you're boiling until it's too late. So I think I have to be generous to those amongst us that are sounding the warning, sending out the warning shots. And it may very well be that I'm the frog that's not very aware of how bad it is. Um, so I, uh, that's why your opening statements make me a little nervous, but that's beside the point because you might be right.
Yep,
His
I
his
hope I'm wrong, but I think I'm right. Go ahead.
Well, I hope you are too. But anyway, but to your question, I would say the founding may shocking here. I think the founding might be of some service to our understanding of what we should do. Um, at the founding, there were three important phrases that came up quite a bit. One was the resistant to the tyrants is obedience to God. That was a key phrase that was all over the American Revolution. Also in the American Revolution, um, there was this phrase. Um, there was this phrase that colonials resisted. It was called the doctrine of non-resistance. And this kind of comes from Romans 13 in the Bible, where Paul, the Apostle Paul, who by the way was a dual citizen, he was Jewish as well as a Roman. He played his Roman citizenship too at the end of his life, hoping that maybe as a Roman citizen he wouldn't get killed. But in Romans 13, let everyone be subject to the governing authority, for there is no authority except that which God has established. Authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against God. So that's known as the doctrine of submission to civil authority. Well, it gets kind of changed, and there were some loyalists. Charles Inglis was a great Anglican priest who had a really wonderful couple essays about the true interest of America's rightly understood during the American Revolution. And the patriots are like to not resist, to have non-resistance, and to take Romans 13 at face value is slavish. The word slavish pops up all the time in this discussion about the doctrine of non-resistance. Another one it comes out of the Declaration. Does the right of revolution exist in the Declaration? So those three concepts at the founding, I think, are important before we talk about, okay, what do we do if we believe Biden's a tyrant, or what do we do if we think Trump is a tyrant? there is a historical tradition of defiance and violent defiance to authority in our history. To whitewash that is to not understand that's in the colonial and revolutionary DNA. Now, and that's scary. That is very scary because where it can get you. So the in the ratification debates, there were three states that submitted the right of revolution should be stated in a Bill of Rights. There were three states that said the doctrine of non-resistance should be deemed as as slavish. So they're sending along. These are amendment suggestions that they felt that is Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina. They want that in our Constitution. Well, what is that? It's always context, right? What does this right of alter or abolish? That's the great, I remember teaching classes and with the people. What is that the right of revolution? That always was kind of a lively discussion. What do we do with that? So there are some key phrases at the founding that are very, very important.
Well,
In considering courses of action. And the history shows that that it goes beyond carrying some signs. It goes beyond carrying some signs. It can
it can
be,
include carrying signs. It can
oh,
include
absolutely.
it can include obviously pounding the pavement there, but you're saying it goes beyond.
Oh, sure. I mean, the frog in the pot, long train of abuses. That's what Jefferson calls it, right? After a long train of abuses. You woke up and you were a frog in the boiling pot and you woke up. There's the long train of abuses. Well, who decides that?
Well,
I'm just saying at the founding, it was all over the literature, and it was accepted that there was going to be some throwdown and violence.
yeah, and one of the things I came across is, or I came across a couple of sources on Germany, and in 33, 34, or after the National Socialists take power, there was this discussion by some, well, we'll get them next election. Well, and then what happens? Well, the
Yeah.
whole electoral process in Germany is suspended and removed there. And so that's the thing. Okay, do you sit there and wait? Because that's the discussion right now. Well, we'll get them at the midterms, and you're
Yeah.
going, well, wait a minute. Are we guaranteed that there's going to be midterms? Or there's going to be another presidential election. I mean, and that's something that citizens have to consider there. So you seem to be saying that without being an advocate of it, but that violence is part of that responsibility of citizens, all right, when they sense
Yeah.
that there is a long train of abuses.
And the elites during the Revolutionary era were nervous about that. I
Right.
mean, they assented to that intellectually, in their heads, conceptually. But so many of those founders were scared if this, because we don't want shays. We don't want shays all over the world. But so it's if Tocqueville was there, he'd have said, "Hey, there's a contradiction." So
Well,
the elites are nervous with this.
right, and I find that, and I don't know if those in the center, left, center, far left, there's a certain element of discomfort with this because of January 6, 2021, and the condemnation, because those who were involved in that event on the violent side, they would make the argument that we were exercising, all right, our responsibility to fight against corruption and tyranny. And so for those who were opposed to that now turn around and advocate more aggressive agitation as a responsibility of citizenship.
Yeah. Well,
Today, it's a little bit
yeah.
uncomfortable.
Well, they were all carrying Gostelo flags, right? The hand of the tyrant, right?
Right. Mike, Chris, thoughts about this responsibility of citizenship in this period of potential darkness, Chris?
Well, don't forget it's a long train of abuses and usurpations. And Jefferson goes on to say not only is your right, he says it's your duty, right? There's an obligation within the Declaration. I think everybody's got the right to revolution one time. It's like free speech. You get the right to free speech one time. And after that, who knows? And I actually, it's funny, Tim, because I just got in explaining to my classes about the frog in the pot because we've been studying the rise of dictators in the 1930s with Mussolini and Hitler and Stalin. And I also brought in Timothy Snyder, who's quite the expert in this. And he actually talks about a democracy being a dimmer switch and not a light switch. And it goes gradually. It's the same analogy as the frog in the pot.
Yeah.
And he talks about Ukraine and what's happening in the Ukraine, and how that is turning the light down on democracy because you have a guy like Volodymyr Zelensky who was democratically elected, whose country was invaded by a tyrant that lives next door, who's trying to restore the former empire, and so does the rest of the world beholden to upholding a democracy there. So that's an interesting idea, I think. So you think about long train of abuses and usurpations. Does that justify violent black revolt in the 1960s?
Yeah, well, see,
Well, there's a great essay in the ratification debates. There it was in the Massachusetts convention where the guy, I love this guy's name. His name is Malachi Arms, and he says, if we believe in the right of revolution, I wonder if African Americans amongst us will claim that right as well. So we ought to be careful when we think about the right of revolution. So, I mean, it comes up when they're debating the Constitution.
so yeah, Chris, curious about your response to a question that I got towards the end of my We the People time coaching We the People. Going through the Declaration, going through those ideas, a student said, "Well, Mr. Richmond, what counts for a long train?" And and I thought it was a great question.
I would refer them to the Doobie Brothers and the long train running.
Long train running, yes.
So
That was not the answer I gave. I wish you
That
would.
beast,
Where were you
that's
when
a
I
tough one to play on the drums, let me tell you.
I would tell them, say, well, keep reading because he's going to get to that long train of
Yeah.
abuses in the list of grievances.
Okay. So, but so you're talking about decades.
Yes.
So is that the long train? It's got to be decades, not a year.
I don't think it's got. I think a year is not enough because there's too much transition that happens in a year by elections and changes and whatnot. I think I think you probably would go back to, if you want to give it a date, I'd say 1763 in the close of the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, and the Proclamation Line of 1763. When these colonists thought, well, we're going to have this land to the west. We won the war. We defeated the French and their Native American allies. And then the crown says, no, no, you can't go out to the west because we can't afford to defend you. So stay here. It's like, well, what do you mean stay here? We thought we were going to go west. Um,
Yeah.
so I think that if you're looking for an exact date, I go with 1763.
Yeah. Mike, any thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And yeah, I've been doing some thinking and talking to folks about this as well. I think there's a wide-ranging tool uh, tool chest that I think students should be thinking about. I think, obviously violence is in there. Um, but I think doing something from that tool chest, whether that is economic boycotting, whether that is either posting, talking to someone, getting off certain platforms as a show, um, and instigating conversations and instigating them in a way that you try to be curious to try to just figure out what people are thinking. I'm feeling like in my communities, there's only one side that's speaking. They feel very emboldened to speak. And there's this, and I think Tim Snyder refers to it, right, as anticipatory sort of like not responding. And so, and I would encourage, like Chris said, the reading. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about those who have in America and elsewhere, because I study South Africa. I've been relooking at some of that history, thinking about what lessons are learned by folks who have faced way more injustices than I have in my life, for sure. But what are those lessons, and what can we learn from reading that and thinking through and being in solidarity with those? I think this is not the time to be a bystander at all. I think whatever you have in your daily life that you can do that little bit and keep it moving is what I think.
Well, gentlemen, we've come to the end of our time on Unit 6, Question 3, and so I'd like to ask you to provide some final thoughts and recommendations to our students and teachers. We'll start with you, Professor Williams.
Yeah, this is well, this is, even though it's long, I think it's a great question. I think it's wonderful that I think understanding the context of when what Douglas is saying here, I think that that's going to be really, really important. I think following the lead of some of Dave's questions about not getting caught up in just this con law case or that con law case, I think is going to be important to sort of think about the moral and ethical duties that we might have, thinking about what we can learn from other places. I think that this question is really rich in terms of what you can bring, and I wouldn't limit yourself to just think about the 14th Amendment as a constitutional provision. Like, think wider than that.
I forgot to ask you, Professor Williams. I know that you're in Arizona spring
Mm.
training. How are your Giants doing?
I haven't looked at the standings, but they'd won 7 in a row till today. Bochy got them today, so
So you guys are going to win the spring training. That's excellent. Enjoy it
it's
while you can.
if
Okay.
we were
Professor
whatever.
Kavanaugh.
Wow, you got that
Um,
in there well.
well, that's hard to follow that because I have some serious things here. So, um, I have a poster in my room with Frederick Douglass, and he says there's no Negro problem. It's whether the American people have honor enough, courage enough, or patriotism enough to live up to their own Constitution. And Dr. King says the same thing. He says, be true to the words you put on paper. I think he says that in his last speech the night before he's assassinated. So I think those are powerful words. I think the other thing, one of my favorite obscure places in the Constitution when we're talking about birthright citizenship is the corruption of blood. When I bust that out with kids before they've actually read the Constitution, and I tell them it sounds like an old Vincent Price movie, and they have no idea who Vincent Price was, so I have to explain that. And for students, he was an old time horror movie guy. So it sounds like an old Vincent Price movie, but it means that guilt is not inheritable. Guilt is not inheritable. So the idea of these children that are born here to people that may be here without papers or may be here illegally, however you want to frame that argument, guilt is not inheritable. It's in our Constitution. And I would also encourage you to take a look at Mahmoud Khalil, who was just arrested. He's here on a green card. He was here on a student visa as well. He's on a green card, which makes him a legal resident.
He's also married
Not,
to an American citizen.
but not an American citizen. So when we started talking about the insular cases earlier, take a look at what's happening in this case, because I think it is hugely important when we start talking about how we're going to treat people. And there is a distinction between the four guys you see here that are citizens and Mahmoud Khalil, who is here as a green card, which means he's a legal resident. He is here legally, and yet he's been locked up at the whim of the State Department. So I would check that out as well.
Professor Moore.
Yeah, I really enjoyed reading the full, once I found it, the full Douglas speech, because I do think he lays out these different kinds of citizenship in a way. And for him, that culminates into legal citizenship. So I would really encourage students to read the full speech and wrestle with, are there other kinds of citizenship? Cultural, obviously the legal, the religious, the economic, the suffering for the country, serve the country. Are there other kinds of citizenship, and how do they interact with the legal, our emphasis generally on legal definitions of citizenship? I'd be prepared to think through that and discuss that with your panel, your judges at nationals, the different kinds of configurations of what citizenship would mean.
Dave, can I throw out one more thing? I'm sorry.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Um, I would encourage students also to go take a look at the dissents by Justice Curtis and Justice McLean in Dred Scott. Look at their dissenting opinions in Dred Scott. You might find some interesting ammunition there.
Well, I hope that we have provided you some insights and some both beginning points and nuances to this question. I hope our conversation was assimilatable for you. I might not understand the use of that word. I'll keep working on it here. Again, we provided. So right now we're having some calendar issues, so we don't know when we're going to be meeting again. But when we do, we are hoping to be able to address Unit 3 question on the Articles of Confederation. Is it the Unit 3 question? No, it's a Unit 3 questions on. It's the Unit 2 question on the Articles of Confederation. We also have a Unit 3 question on voting, I believe, is coming down the pipeline that we hope to get to. So sometime in the future, we'll see you again. Until then, peace, love, you ever tacos. Opening day is just around the corner. Bye-bye, bye bonds.